All right, Dr. Breen, right?
Yes,
Thank you for coming on today. Appreciate it.
my pleasure.
All right, so first off, so you're a professor at UNB in Fredericton, right?
Yes, yes.
And what are you exactly like? Like you're an associate professor of? Is it like educational leadership? Is that your official role?
Well, actually, I got promoted. Now I'm a full
Okay,
professor
well,
of educational
congratulations.
leadership. Yeah, so full professor, educational leadership, and educational administration leadership is my title, I guess.
Okay, right on. So I looked through and I've looked through this a few times because like in the future I've looked at potentially exploring master's and PhD programs myself. And I always see the word administrative theory. What exactly is the theory behind the administration? Because even the word administration almost comes across as being like a very orderly process that wouldn't necessarily have a theory attached to it.
Well, we have a course. I teach a course called administrative theory. So
Hmm.
I guess I'll start with the theory part. So
Sure.
theory is designed to provide either an explanation or description or an understanding of why things happen.
Hmm.
So administrative theory would be a description or an explanation or an understanding of how how schools are administered or how organizations operate, how people in
Hmm.
organizations behave, and how organizations as a whole behave, and how people in them or act.
Yep. And so, like, what do you mean by the way an organization behaves? Because I often hear, like I know Adam Grant. I don't know him personally, obviously, but like he talks about organizational psychology and like the health of a culture and stuff. So, is that kind of what you're referring to in that aspect?
It could be. It's. I mean, in some respects, an organization is an abstraction. I mean,
Hmm.
if you belong to a school, you might say the school or the staff is an organization, and therefore it has its own personality or its own. It behaves in certain ways,
Hmm.
but that's more of an abstraction because really you have people in an organization, and people behave certain ways, and when you sort of add up the behavior of all the people in the organization, then we say, well, that's the organization behaves this way. But there are certainly
Okay.
things that happen uh, because of the nature of organization where things become part of the culture. In other words, there are certain people behave certain ways because that's how the people in the organization believe this is the right way to behave, or the things that are
Hmm.
important. So we call those things the culture. Like the things that are important, or the things that are considered to be right and wrong, or valuable or true. That collection of views is called the culture of an organization.
Okay. And so, in the course, no pun intended, of an administrative theory course, I guess what are the kind of like the differing ideas or differing ideas, sorry, that you would like kind of masters or PhD students to kind of take away of like, okay, like what perspectives or views can do I now have that I can incorporate into whatever setting I'm going into?
Well, in the course I teach, I've been using a book written by some UK authors. It's actually written more for a business audience, but it's flexible enough that it works in education.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a bunch of different topics that the book has, and I like. So therefore, I've organized a course that way. One of the things to start with is called entering and leaving, like how people enter an organization, and also how people leave an organization. But if you think back to entering, for example, if you apply for a job, you might write a letter, you
Hmm.
might go for an interview, and you present yourself to the organization as somebody who might be good to work there.
Hmm.
Conversely, those who are in the organization who are interviewing you or who are portraying the organization when you go for the interview, they're also portraying the organization to you as well. In other words,
Hmm.
it's almost like both sides are
Yeah.
selling their organization to the other. So the applicant is trying to sell themselves as I'm a good teacher for the school, but the school is also trying to sell itself to the applicant that this is a place where you may want to work, or this is a place that expects certain things, and then we want to see if you fit in. So there's very much a performance. So that's the other thing
Hmm.
in my course over the course over the course of the term, we talk about how in organizations people perform. You act in certain ways, you behave certain ways. It's sometimes called a game. Now that sounds
Hmm.
derivative, but it's the
Yeah.
fact is when people are working together, they're playing a game. They're interacting, they're competing, they're making like in a sports game, you're making moves. In an organization, you make moves, you make decisions, you take action. So there's a whole dynamic how people behave in the organization, and that's I say in the book it talks about the game, metagame. So things like communication, conflict resolution, learning, how people learn the organization. What are the rules? Like what are the rules? Both the official rules and the unwritten rules.
Hmm.
And then of course, there's other things like, well, actually, the funny thing, the book I had was written in 2010. So talk about what if we had a world where we could work from home? Now that was in 2010. Like, but that was futuristic thinking in 2010.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's come to pass. So anyway, but the workplace, so what happens in the workplace? What's it mean when you have your workers working together in the same space versus when they're working remotely? How does it affect the dynamics? How do you trust people differently if you don't see them all the time? There are some workplaces where managers want the workers back in the office because they think they can supervise more closely because maybe they don't trust the workers to work, as diligently when they're not
But
there.
even mentoring closer too. Like it's always, I think that always kind of comes down to the negative of like, oh, they're trying to pull us back into the office so that we have to be there with someone over our shoulder. But it's also like you're not getting the same one. The connection part is obvious.
Yes.
You're not getting that same like the day-to-day kind of water cooler conversations that really like the little nuggets of learning usually kind of come out without even like trying to.
Yes.
But yeah, sorry, continue.
Well, I was going to say, and that's a good point because it works both ways. I mean, the managers will have reasons why they want their workers, whether there's teachers or other workers, on site versus having them remotely, and it works both ways. And same with people in an organization. For some people, really value the talking to people, seeing people day to day, having their offices nearby, having informal conversation. Other people, they don't care. I mean, that doesn't matter as much. I know that there are pros and cons. I mean, I can see a benefit to like a hybrid office space where, you come to work like on site 3 days a week and you're home 2 days. I mean, some people think coming to work means working, and not being at work means you're not working.
Yeah.
Or if working, I mean, that whole idea of work time being at a work site is an artificial creation of an early era. So you can be working, you can be at the office and not working. You can be playing on Facebook or whatever you do, or you can be at home and working, just not under the sight of your employer.
Yeah, because I saw a picture the other day on Facebook, and it was like a nice successful day of scrolling and watching golf videos for 8 hours at work, and then I went home. So it's like, you can definitely find ways to procrastinate either at the office or at school. But I kind of like that, because I guess that's kind of been one of my questions, is that there's always this kind of discussion of like, okay, what actually makes teachers a profession? And I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole, but the fact that your leadership course is kind of structured around topics from a business text that you kind of adapt. So I guess, like, what are kind of the general leadership topics, ideas that you generally tend to instill? And I guess, are there any specific leadership ideas that are distinct to education that you find are really important for people to like cultivate or to know?
Well, I think part of it, education, especially K-12 education, your clientele, for use a business term, are children, as opposed to if you're working in a corporate setting where you're working lawyers and accountants where they're adults. So you have this child focus, which means there's a much more protective interest in the children that you're teaching. Obviously, you can't easily teach children from home. Well, other than during the pandemic, you try to do it on Zoom.
Which you can do your best, but
exactly. So there's that. So part of so obviously a business textbook is not going to talk about how to deal with children, but the questions around learning. So how people learn. So again, there's one chapter we talk about how people learn. Some people learn by reading. Some people learn by doing. Some people learn by experiences. Some people need like tactile learning. Some people like to do physical, all that kind of thing. Now, that's true for adults. It's also true for children. I mean, it's that same thing. Now, in organizations, particularly from a leadership point of view, the leader's role is normally to help the learning of the employees. So, for example, principals or superintendents, their target would be to help the learning of the teachers, and teachers are directing the learning of the children, right? So it's not the principal's job to teach students directly. It's not directly. The principals and superintendents, their job is to help the teachers with their learning, so then they can turn around and pass the learning on to the children. Because again, children learn differently from adults, right? So that would be one. That's one topic which would be distinct education, is distinction between teaching for the learning for adults and learning of children.
Okay, and I kind of want to. I don't mean to already bring us into some controversial territory, and I don't mean to go into anything really, but I guess my question is, there's this kind of unwritten status game in teaching I've kind of noticed a little bit, and not because people like they want to be leaders or vice principals or principals and like kind of like work their way up the ladder, but they don't want to like look like they're doing that. You know what I mean? So I guess the question would be like, how does one navigate that you're still kind of there for teaching the kids, but you're also in at the same time, like you're trying to work your own learning and career and potential income and that kind of stuff. So I guess like, how do you kind of advise principals to, or people that are looking to get into leadership to kind of navigate that like status shift almost?
Well, that's a great question, because when we have students apply to do their MEd, and most of my courses that I teach are MEd courses, in their application they'll say why they're applying for the MEd in education administration leadership, as opposed to curriculum or special ed or whatever. And so normally they will say why they're applying for this program, and they'll say things like they want to make a difference in a different way. So they'll say, I've been teaching my classroom, but I see bigger things that need to happen in schools and education generally. So I'm pursuing, well, they'll normally say I'm pursuing master's studies to see if the path that will work for me would be to go into being a VP, principal, that path, or not. Because some people will find out that, VP thing, I don't want to go to meetings, do budgets, handle complaints. So some people realize reality, what's involved. It's not all glamour. And so that's part of what they'll learn in the course. I'll explain to them in different courses, whether you're talking about a course in educational change or in theory, whatever, is, okay, here's what the kind of decisions, the kind of difficulties, challenges that principals deal with that are different from classroom teachers. I will explain that sometimes principals are act as a buffer between what's happening outside and what's happening in the classroom. So principal will be the buffer so the teachers don't deal with some things because the principal has taken that action. So principals often end up taking calls from parents who are complaining and so on, or taking directives from the government, and the principal will try to manage that and decide what's going to get passed on to the classroom teachers and what's not. In other words, there'll be that kind of as I say, a buffering or a filtering mechanism. So class teachers will know that because they do their thing. So master's courses help open up that window to see, oh, this is what my principal is really doing, and this is what he or she has to deal with that I never knew about. And then decide whether, okay, is this something I want to pursue? Now, some people say, yeah, I want to be in there making decisions that affect the whole school or the whole district or the whole province. So they see that. I try to point them towards things that matter to them. Generally in grad course, compared to undergrad course, I encourage students to try to focus, like find an area of focus within the course. So even though I might give them 10 or 20 chapters to read or books to read, they don't have to know them all, but they find things they're most interested in, kind of focus their thinking that way.
Like a semi-thesis almost? Like,
well, not quite that. That would be a more really focused.
Okay.
But for example, when I did my master, the first year I did 3 courses in the term, and I ended up doing my science all around the role of department heads, just because I found it interesting. So in one course, there's only around supervision, one was about admin theory, one was about something else. So I encourage students to try to focus with things, because at the grad level, you want to have some depth. So you want to get into the depth of what you're learning and really have a lot more choice because you've chosen to do a master's degree. Like undergrad degrees, often you have to do a bunch of courses, including ones you don't.
Yeah. It's kind of prescribed for you in a sense.
That's right. Whereas grad level, it's more important to find your focus. And therefore, if you can find your learning, draw learning from this course and what I'm doing in my school and so on, and bring it to bear in the course, that can make your study much more valuable.
And even for yourself, because I've had people that have asked me, or like I've talked to people like doing their masters, whatever, and they've always said like, I'm going to wait until I know what I kind of want to study, but they don't really know what they want to study. Do you kind of like, not recommend, but I guess like when you go into education and start a graduate, you almost kind of find it? Is that usually kind of what happens?
Well, yeah. As I say, that because they have to apply, they have to write a letter saying why they want to do the master's.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So they do have to articulate they've been thinking of something. Obviously, you have to figure it out, but they need to show, they can't just say, I want to take the course because I want to make more money or something like that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not.
Yeah.
Because we can't admit everybody who applies. So we're picking out people who give them thought to leadership. I mean, sometimes people go through leadership roles, like they may have been like a teacher, as a teacher, maybe coaching a sports team, or maybe they're on a committee that organized the grad or the prom, or they may be involved in leadership on a curriculum project. So those are all leadership, right? So because sometimes people think leadership equals a title, like you're a leader if you have you're a VP or principal, but people can be leaders in a lot of different ways. And so they could do the master and decide, you know what, I like being a leader in my school, but not principal. I want to be a leader in terms of other ways of being a leader, because they may not want to do that particular defined role. So so in the courses, they may be thinking in terms of what they want to learn. It's helpful if they know that, but it's also okay to change paths, right? They could start to think, okay, I really want to do this, but they realize, oh no, they really catch a desire to follow a different path, and that's totally fine.
And I've noticed as well, because I've had conversations with people who are VPs and principals, and the money conversation does come up because obviously they do make a bit more, and as they should. You're taking on so much more responsibility. But I guess for yourself, from because I think it would be fair to say generally across the board, it's usually a 6 to 8% raise from teacher to VP, and then probably another 6 to 8% to principal. Is that do you almost think that should be more stratified, or do you think that's kind of a reasonable way that provinces generally deal with that?
Well, that's part of the collective agreement. So you can look up the collective agreement for New Brunswick to see what the exact amount is. It's added on as it's added on as an allowance. So the teacher gets a salary based on their years of experience and their the number of years of university study on a grid. And then if you're a department head, or what they call here an SPR, you get an allowance, and then VPs get an allowance, and principals get an allowance. And I think it's based on the size of the school. And I don't know what the percentage is. So it is stratified by school size. So if you're the principal of FHS, French High School, it'd be more than if you're principal of Minto High School, for example, just the size. Now, at some point, the size thing may not capture the whole complexity of the job. Because once schools get bigger, if you're a principal of a big school, you also have VPs. If you're a small school, you may have no VP, so you're on your own. So I'm not sure.
Which is kind of crazy.
That kind of gets bargained out between the union and the government, because principals are part of the union. So it's part of that bargaining process. So, I mean, it's good. The duties are often not understood well by those who aren't principals. And I had a doctoral student who did a study of what would be the motivating factors and the reluctance factors for somebody who's a good qualified teacher who may or may not choose to go into principalship. And one of the things they found was the money really isn't there because you work more hours, you work more meetings. The stress is way more evenings taken up for meetings, stuff like that. So the money isn't really the big driver, because there's not really that much comparatively more money. You really have to do it because you want to make changes, you want to make a difference in the schools. That's usually the reason people go into that. Or nobody else want to do it, right? You think, okay, well, I don't do it. Who else is going to do it? So I'll do it. Because it's been hard for districts to staff schools at that level, because a lot of people aren't finding the principalship to be a desirable position.
And that's kind of where I was actually exactly going. As I'm sure the fact that you followed that kind of path with that thought kind of brings it up. But I guess one thing I've heard is that, so like I just mentioned, I just recently got hired in New Brunswick, and I don't know if this is a secret or not. I don't think it is. And if it is, maybe I'll find out and I can take it out of this episode. But when I was being interviewed, I was like, I'm potentially, and maybe this is a bad question to ask, because I said, what are the needs in your district for the future? And I can kind of, even though I might have my own interests, if I can solve a big need potentially with my own education, that's something I would also consider. And literally just told me point blank right after, 2/3 of our administrative staff across the districts in Anglophone South, I think, are eligible retirement in the next 3 years. And I was like, oh, so it seems like it's a very dire issue that everyone's kind of just well, I guess we'll figure it out. But I guess first, what are your thoughts on just how quickly we are approaching, in not even just New Brunswick, everywhere, but specifically our context here, this new wave of younger, likely more inexperienced VPs, resource teachers, and principals, not so much district staff, etc.
Yeah, it's a real thing. And in fact, I think I told you I was teaching a course in Woodstock this summer. And part of the reason why we're doing this course was that the district person there said we have a shortage of principals, vice principals. Can you offer some grad courses in Woodstock to increase the pool of people who would be qualified to take up those roles? And so we designed a 5-course cohort. So myself and my colleague, we've now done 4 of those courses. And yeah, it's because people aren't sort of jumping into the roles. And so by providing these courses, we make it easier for them the teachers to explore the idea of being in leadership roles and, provide instruction. Part of what I try to do is teach them what the boundaries are, because it's so easy at that level to have everybody telling you what to do. And I think that's part of the reason why people are not keen on being principals, vice principals, because there's this expectation to do everything anybody wants, like you're all things, all people. And so I often try to tell the students I'm teaching, okay, put boundaries around what's expected from you. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, my legal duties, but I don't have to provide every single service that everybody wants. I don't need to be available 24/7. It's not that kind of thing. You can say no to demands by a bunch of people, except maybe the government. But even then, if people push too hard, then you need to push back and say, well, look, I don't need to do this. I could take a different job. And people vote with their feet, right? I mean, if people find the jobs too demanding and unrealistic, people make other choices. And other choices might involve going to a different profession or stepping back from leadership roles and say, you know what, I'm going back to my classroom. Leave me alone. I'm going to teach my class. Don't tell me about anything else. There's that kind of possibility.
So do you think that, like, as we kind of go, I guess, 5-10 years, that, and I guess maybe that was kind of my point about, like, if you see, like, even you mentioned the principals, they don't necessarily get a raise because they're just working way more hours. I guess, if that's something that you could advocate for at a union, but you also don't really want to influence people with money in a weird way in education. Like, I know, like, we're all living, we all want to go on vacations and have vehicles, whatever. But at the same time, should that almost be like something that's discussed more with, like, the actual VP principal salary, kind of getting, like, more, I guess, financial incentive to kind of take on that much responsibility?
Well, I think the money is certainly relevant. That would be called, extrinsic motivation, like more money. But more money doesn't change the workload, right? I have a couple of friends in Ontario who've been doing a lot of studies on principal workload, and they talk about work intensification and just both the quantity of work, the intensity of the work, like the emotional intensity of the work. Paying more money isn't going to change that. So my suggestions are more along the lines of, why don't we redesign what's expected of a principals? And so, okay, principals, you do these things and we'll pay for that, but let's have other people do other things. So when I was in Alberta as well, I was there from 99 to 2005. The schools I visited, they had a principal, and they also had a business manager. So it was a staff person who handled all the budget, handled all the bookkeeping, all the sort of organizational stuff. So the principals are really, in Alberta for sure, they're focused on instructional improvement, like, because Alberta's all test scores, that kind of thing. And so the principals, that was their role. Their job to be instructional leader. Now they were in charge of everything in schools. That was the difference in Edmonton for sure. They had the site-based management. The principal decided, like, all the money came to the principal, but they had the business manager for that kind of thing. And the principal could therefore decide, okay, I'm going to spend my time on this, and other people do this. And I'm not going to do, like, I'm going to carve out time for instructional leadership or doing PD with teachers or whatever the principal decides, because they could choose your own priorities, and they would sort of outsource or hire other people to do other things, whether it's, leading extracurricular or.
Also, with the budget, they could kind of, like, hire internal positions. Interesting.
That's right. Now they had to work within the budget. There was no more money for the district. They got all the money. So you want to hire an extra business manager. Well, then you don't have money. You can't go back and say, well, now I want to have more computers. Well, no, you spent the money on this. So you have to decide. But that was an Alberta thing where they had a chance to choose. Here, there's not much latitude there. The budgets are pretty much fixed. So principals don't have much latitude with regard to that. But certainly makes sense to say, well, for the leaders, like the district level, to say, okay, we want principals to focus on instructional leadership, if that's what they want to say. Then don't expect them also to be handling all the parent bookings of the school, handling all the like doing the budget, and like all that kind of thing. That those are gonna, if you're gonna spread the duties out, then you can't expect people to feel a sense of accomplishment. We're trying to do everything at once.
And I guess I've never thought of this question before, but I almost feel like when it comes to burnout, et cetera, that whole kind of lane, and not that I necessarily want to go down that lane, but like I've never really heard the conversation of like the role of principal being as stressful as like the role of superintendent. You know what I mean? Like, are those higher kind of district leadership positions almost a bit more regimented than the role of principal because it is kind of so day to day as a principal versus the other ones are more kind of predictable?
Well, I was well, just as I say, classroom teachers often don't know what principals do because principals act as a buffer. I
Mm-hmm.
would say, because I've never worked in a superintendent's office, I would say that probably principals might think, oh, superintendent is easy, he's just in his office taking
Mm-hmm.
calls, whatever. But if people work in the district office will say, no, we're dealing with other things.
Yeah.
Generally, the higher up you go, the more political you get. So
Yeah.
therefore, superintendents deal more with the DEC, which is the elected body, but also with the government. So the superintendent might be doing buffering from what's coming from the department down to the districts.
Mm-hmm.
So the superintendent is managing that. Plus, the superintendent is also managing all the employees in the district, including bus drivers, custodians, all that kind of thing. Plus all the public expectations, plus
Yeah.
everything else, right? So they all have their lanes they work in.
Yeah.
And I think the way to get out of burnout is to allow people to be successful in what they're expected to do and not be expected to do things that aren't realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want the superintendent to be you want him or her to be the key PR guy or girl for the district, then let them do that and let
Mm-hmm.
them hire enough staff to handle busing or curriculum or PD or hiring or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But give people a reasonable job that they can reasonably be successful at rather than give me a whole bunch of things and feel like you're not doing anything well enough.
Yeah, because it seems like most positions in education that I've like observed pretty much bring you about 50 to 55 hours a week during the school year, I would say, roughly speaking. And that would be like an average. Obviously, some weeks you're going to work 38, some you might work 70, but and obviously you get your summers off. But I do think that there has been a tendency to kind of, as we've started to have more turnover in schools, that like there's almost not even a pressure, it's almost like a self-imposed guilt that like you'll do the extra two or three things that ends up kind of like you almost compile it on yourself, which is like a pattern I've noticed just in myself as well, and also just in people around me. But I guess I think, has that always kind of just been part of the gig to you? Is that something that it's like a teacher personality thing?
Well, yes, there's certainly the unwritten expectation that not only will you teach your assigned courses, but you will take part in clubs or
Mm-hmm.
teams or something. Often at the interview process, that might be raised as, what would you be like? What would you be interested in doing in terms of, adding to the school community? So
Mm-hmm.
those things are not normally in the collective agreement, so they're
Mm-hmm.
definitely voluntary. Um, and then, of course, you may have heard a couple of years ago there was a work to rule in Nova Scotia where work to rule means you only do what's in the legally
The
mandated
fine
text.
print. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why there was no more that for a period of time there was no more sports, extracurricular, anything, because people just expect a teacher to do that, but they're not really paid for that. They're not compensated in the same way as they are for teaching classes, and so they become an expectation. Well, at some point, when does that expectation become unreasonable? Um,
Yeah. Like
and then
the
of course what happens too is people go further into their career. They might say, you know what, I've been doing coaching for 20 years. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm tired. I want a break. I'm getting close to retirement. The new teachers can do that. Well, the
yeah.
new teachers will do that because they want to get a permanent job.
Yeah.
Is it fair to our new teachers to pile on extra things to do when they're still trying to get their instructional practices strengthened and
Yeah.
deal with a whole new job and so on. So, what's a fair distribution? And I would say it's better to make it voluntary because then people choose. But then
Mm-hmm.
people are choosing things they want to do. Like they'll choose to coach
Yeah.
a team or lead a club because that's something they're interested in. Teachers do like doing that because it does give them connection with students outside the
Yeah.
classroom. So people do that because they like that. But when it becomes an expectation that you have to do this, well, no, you don't. I mean if people get pushed too hard on that, they'll say, well, you know what? I'm only required to teach. I teach my 4 or 5 courses or whatever it is. If you're going to push me, I'm not doing all these extra stuff.
Absolutely. And I wrote this down I was kind of like prepping for this. And I have noticed that the principals that have dealt with so far in my career have all been like fantastic, super nice people, like very reasonable and kind of what they expect from you. But even so, like my grandfather was a principal as well, and everything that like people talk about him when he was a principal was he was pretty much like he showed up at 8 a.m. He yelled until 5 p.m. Then he went home. Like that was kind of like the narrative back then. And so like I guess how much has like the idea of what a principal is like throughout your study of leadership? So I'm assuming like if you're obviously now a full professor of educational leadership, something about this appealed to you as like a lane of interest. But how has kind of like that expectation of who and what a principal is changed like throughout your kind of development?
Well, certainly there's been a greater increase in what people call shared leadership or collaborative leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than the principal being seen as being the sort of autocratic, top-down, charge
Mm-hmm.
everything, which, as we just saying, is not
Yeah.
realistic for
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So the idea now, I think people coming up expect to have decision making be shared. So the days of a principal just decreeing that here's how everything's going to be, this, here's what we're going to do for everything, making all the rules, telling you what to do. I think that's gone. That's past.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the flip side of that, of course, is if we have shared decision making, that means teachers have to take ownership for what gets decided. So if a staff gets together and decides we will do this, and it doesn't work out, you can't say, "Oh well, that was my idea. The principal decided that." Well, no, that's you had a say in that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the flip side, of course, would be that sometimes there's some decisions where staff don't care either way. They rather let the principal decide, and he or she will make the decision, and they'll just go along with whatever it is because it's something outside of their interest or their expertise or whatever. Because people only have so much, mental bandwidth to decide everything, right? So, as at school, there are some things that I was fine either way. Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. And other things that really care to me. So, like the principal would be dictatorial on things that matter to me. Well, that's different. But if in my case, my principals, they decided things that I was fine either way with, or I didn't feel like I want to get heavily into discussion about it. Fine, that's fine with me. So that's definitely the difference. Is that there's expectation now of more shared decision making at the school level. And the same thing at the district level, the principals that want to be involved with decisions that the superintendent's making, the same kind of culture, I would say, like a culture of decision making is. I think society's moved away from one person deciding everything, but instead decision being made sort of collectively. And the idea is if it's done collectively, then there's more buy-in. Like if we decide this together, then we'll work on it together, and we'll be trying to make whatever we decided be successful because we're in it together. Whereas if somebody else decides something, you didn't like it, well, if it fails, well, you don't care because you could have said, "Well, I told you so."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation once with another principal who told me basically like this was kind of one of the surprising responsibilities that I guess you kind of take on. It seems very obscure, and I guess it might vary from place to place. I'm not sure, but basically they said, I am responsible for the safety and well-being of a student from the second they leave their home in the morning to school and the second they leave the building till they walk on their front door. I guess like in terms of maintaining safety outside of the school, like within the reasonable time frame. I guess what are your thoughts on that? And if you don't necessarily agree that that's the case everywhere, what are some of like the strange responsibilities that principals sometimes take on?
Well, remember I said about people need to put boundaries. So now it is true if a student takes the bus. So yes,
okay,
school,
maybe that's what it was. Yeah,
if the student gets on the bus and goes to school, then yes, once the kid sets foot on the bus, till they get to school until they get home again, yes, that's within the scope of the school's responsibility. Schools, teachers have a duty of care during that time. So the well-being of students and well-being has become the word. The meaning of well-being has really gotten wider than it was in the past. Like physical safety, emotional safety, all that kind of thing. But yeah, that's certainly true for a bus kid. Now, a kid who walks to school, well, it's really not reasonable if the kid is walking 5 blocks from home to school for the principal to be responsible for what happens on the walk from home to school because you can't assign staff to supervise off school. So that's unrealistic to say that they're responsible for that, for things that happen outside the school day and outside the school property. But what has cropped up has been things like internet, cyberbullying, which of course doesn't have any physical boundaries. And so, like if a kid says, "Well, they wrote, a fellow student wrote mean things about me on the internet at home in the evening, and they're still harassing me at school about it," Well, are we responsible for that? Well, yes. At school, yes. And because it started at home, but it affects the school, then yes, schools get involved. But it's really important for schools to put boundaries around, okay, what things are we going to deal with and what things are going to let the parents and the police or whatever it is happen. Because school staff don't want to get involved in everything that happens on kids' weekends, right? If two high school kids get into a fight at the arena on a Saturday night, unrelated to school, that's not the VP's job to deal with, right? Unless they come back to school and start keeping on fighting, well, that's fine. But so schools have to put boundaries on what is our responsibility and what is not. And when you don't put those boundaries, then of course you're going to get piled on, and again you feel the sense of stress, and again you feel like you're not successful because there's no way to be successful when things are inside your scope.
And for the cyberbullying thing, because so I had a conversation with he's like the president of the ATA, Jason Schilling, and he was saying to me that one of the most surprising things that it's probably become the most urgent issue, I guess, would be violence against teachers in the classroom. And like that was physical was kind of what he was referring to mostly. And like I've seen it myself, especially like with EAs and teachers just like dealing with their students, and just like it's not uncommon to get hit 3 or 4 times a day, which is not something you'd expect. And I feel like that one's kind of obvious about like how a teacher or EA can or should respond in a professional manner when they're in a kind of like a violent altercation. But excuse me, what has cyberbullying kind of brought to the table in terms of unexpected questions a profession would face?
Yeah, well, I had a doctoral student about 10 years ago. She started a study on harassment, cyberbullying of educators by parents and students. And the difficulty is, well, there are a bunch of difficulties. One, of course, is the boundary question, that if somebody does something outside of school, like outside the school grounds, it's harder for the school to apply discipline to a student. That's one problem. The other problem with cyberbullying, of course, is anonymity, because it won't be Joe Smith. It'll be, XYZ123 kind of thing. Post these mean things. So it's hard to identify who did the bullying. The other thing, of course, is the 24/7 nature of the thing. In other words, you can be getting harassed online when you're home, and there's no respite from it. Now, for teenagers, well, in the past, some parents would say, "Oh, well, we'll just take away the phone." Well, of course, that's just like a death sentence for a teenager because they don't want to lose their phone, right? So therefore, they wouldn't report cyberbullying because they'd be afraid their parents would take the phone away. Now, adults, of course, should be not that dependent. But we do. So you end up with this situation, well, how can you respond? And then there's the idea, well, if you are too heavy-handed, like if you were to say, I'm going to call the cops on this student who did something, oh, it's just a kid. Oh, it's just a kid. You don't want to do that. Well, I think Jason Schilling would say ATA people do need to go after people who harass. I know other unions have said, no, we're gonna file a defamation suit against the student and the parents if they've posted something that's inappropriate. In other words, they have to fight back, and that makes sense to me, because if you don't fight back, then you get more. So
it would be more of like a union thing, kind of responding more so than a district, in a sense.
Both, but they have a different role. The employer has a legal duty to look after the well-being of the employer's employees, right? That's like any workplace. Your employer has to make sure you have a safe workplace. Now, obviously, you're working in a factory or a lumber mill.
Very different from cyberbullying, but still, like the idea persists.
Right, because if your bullying was associated with you being a teacher, in other words, if this is some random person bullying you, it's somebody bullying you because you're a teacher at a school. That means the employer does have a role to protect the teacher against the bullying and at least take some response. Now, if that means disciplining the student, if it means at least going to the internet provider to tell them to shut it down, take down the posts, like the employer has a duty of care to their employees. And that would be the same with the EA who's being assaulted. Like, it's not okay that happens. And so, no, I mean, my view is there shouldn't be being hit 3 times a day. It'd be one time and that's it. That kid's never there again. That'd be my extreme view.
Yes, yeah.
But still, that's not part of the job. If you're like some jobs have inherent risks. Like if you're a firefighter, you're going to go to fires. Like you might be burned. If you're a police officer, you might have but I don't think educators should expect to be subjected to violence. That's not part of the job. Therefore, no, we can put boundaries on that, and the employer has to do that. So that's the employer job. The union's role is to protect its members. Because the union represents the members. So now their scope is related to the collective agreement. So if the collective agreement says something like members are entitled to be treated fairly, or the union might say to the employer, you have a duty to care to our employees. You have to do something, and the union can push, but they can only push within the scope of the collective agreement. So they can file a grievance, but it can only be with regard to the collective agreement. Otherwise, they have to file a workplace, like an unsafe workplace type of
Okay,
that kind of like a workers' complaint kind of thing.
Yeah, because I've heard, unfortunately, too many instances of it, like the physical one, but also like students making like TikTok pages and like making fun of their teachers, and it's I like there's something to be said about a teacher's got to have thick skin, especially if you're kind of teaching like Div 2 or Div 3, like those grade 4 to 9s, they will give you a run for your money. But at the same time, it's like my goal is to build a relationship and help you learn, not deal with this constant kind of beratement of my character online that anyone can see. Right. Like it's like also my colleagues can see this, and you might like, oh, what did they actually do in their classroom? And it kind of starts this kind of gossip wheel.
Yeah. But teachers can push back. I mean, teachers have a right to push back.
And they usually do. Yeah.
They have abuse. I mean, there's like kids need to learn that abuse is not, if you can't dish it out, if you can't take it, you can't dish it out, right? So, like, if you think it's okay to say mean things about people, especially things that aren't true, do you want that happen to you? Like, people sometimes think, oh, it's just all a game because they're young, they think it's all like TikTok just a game. Well, no, in real life, you wouldn't want that. Mm-hmm. And like in real life, you might actually get fired from your job if you were to do something like that. Like if you did that to your employer, if you're working for like a company, they would fire you. So in school, you could get disciplined, but if we don't let kids see the consequence of that, then they'll keep on doing it until they learn the harder lesson.
Absolutely. And I don't mean to go too deep into too many huge topics here today, but and this is my own flaw as a teacher, I would say, and kind of like my early stages of my career so far, is that one thing I've noticed within myself and in kind of the schools that I've been in is that there's often a lot of disagreement on how to discipline, what the stages of discipline are, the classic conversation of, is there detention? How long is detention? Do you keep them after school, but then the teacher has to stay after school? There's so much that goes into it. And especially now I see a lot of the provinces kind of walking back to cell phone policies, which I'm sure you probably talk about all the time in your classes. But I guess even the cell phone conversation is going to come down to enforcement. But I guess if you were appointed principal of a high school of 800 kids and it was 10 to 12 or 9 to 12, how would you kind of refresh like modern discipline? Like what is kind of the new stages? And I guess like what would you have to say to that?
Well, there's a British author, his name's Tom Bennett. And you may see him he's pretty prolific on Twitter. He's the advisor to the UK government on student behavior. And he writes about how it's really important to teach behavior, just like you teach math, just like you teach English, just like you teach things, to teach behavior. Because to assume that students know, well, this is correct behavior, is probably not a realistic assumption, because we don't know that students know that it's not okay to yell at people or interrupt people or swear at people. Some people may come from families that's not obvious.
Yeah.
So he makes a point of starting out proactively of actually teaching behavior, teaching students what's expected before bad things happen. Like you say, he'll say right from the start, here's what we expect. This is what happens. And they constantly reinforcing those norms. And of course he talks about from the teacher level right up to the top, the head teacher role, sort of consistent messages about what the norms are, like what is right. And then, but he doesn't get heavily into sanctions, but he does say it's important to have sanctions, but he says sanctions like penalties aren't enough. Like you can't just sanction your way out of problems, but you have to do this teaching and constant reinforcement. And then when something happens and there's a boundary, then you have a sanction. Now it doesn't have to be a crazy, harsh sanction, just some sanction that says, no, this is the line, you can't do that. Because students respond better to something that's certain as opposed to something that's uncertain but seems like really big. So in other words, if you're told, okay, if you are, for example, if you show up late for class, you will have to spend 5 minutes after class. That's not a major penalty, but if you're late,
it's certain. It's not an empty threat.
Exactly. So be certain, and then it's just, of course you make it, if it happens more, then the penalties get larger. But the point is, what you're teaching is we show up on time, because showing up on time shows respect for the people around you. It doesn't interrupt, all that kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
So that would be the start point, would be to teach what is the expected behavior in very clear, student-friendly language, like not fluffy, grand schemes like we care for each other,
Yeah,
we're a
like
puzzler.
specific, like you do
Yeah,
this instead of that,
that's
like
right.
a replacement behavior, basically.
That's right.
Mhm.
Now, of course, students, just like students need different types of instructions. So just in courses, it's the same with behavior. So some students will be say, in this school, we treat each other with kindness, and that'd be fine. They know what that means. But some people need to be saying, kindness means no hitting, no punching,
Yeah.
no yelling, that kind of thing. So you can tailor the lesson to the student involved. But that'd be the first thing, would be to set that. So the other thing, of course, related to have boundaries. Like, here's what the boundaries are. If you go beyond that, here's a consequence, or whatever's going to follow, and just stick to that. Like, don't try to, renegotiate and talk. Don't do a lot of talking, just a lot of straight actions. That would be
Mhm.
my thought around that. But it also means you're going to need to push back against people who will say, "Oh, this student has this X, Y, or Z, special circumstance." Well, there are special circumstances, but not everybody has that, right? So
Yeah.
I don't care if you have a hard home life. That doesn't justify coming in class and yelling at people.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing. And it's not about that. It's just, in this class we have to learn. And that's the other thing, is there needs to be focus on learning, because there has to be, like, students come to school for a purpose, and it's learning. It's their workplace. So everything needs to be focused around, you're here to learn. We're here to learn. We're not here to just hang out and play around. So these certain behaviors are needed to learn. Other behaviors are interrupting learning. So that'd be kind of my overall focus, would be
Mhm.
teaching proper behavior, and also emphasis on what matters, which is treating people properly, each other properly, and learning. Because we're not
Absolutely.
learning, what are we doing here?
Yeah, because that's kind of always been I would say, generally agreed upon perception of, because I've always personally disliked when people are like, oh, like this kid has a hard home life and that's why they behave that way. But it's like, okay, well, that's actually like our purpose to intervene now. Like, we
Mhm,
have them for this 90
mhm,
minutes a day. Like,
mhm,
it's easy to let them kind of sit on their phone, scroll, and kind of be absent. But at
mhm,
the same time, it's also literally our role to, like, it's not, again, at the end of the day, outcome 1.7 of math 10 is important, but it's also trying to get them to kind of behave and
mhm.
to the norms almost, right? That is, that's kind of more my
Yeah,
perspective
yeah,
than maybe that's not the best perspective, maybe,
yeah,
if someone's a real academic stickler. But
yeah,
again, everything will come in waves. But
yeah.
so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I did notice, because we're kind of touched on parental involvement there, and I know that you've done some work on. The general question would be like, how involved should parents be in their education, in their kids' education, and in like what the school does?
Well, I would say they can be as involved as they choose to be.
Mhm.
Um, Understanding the sort of the developmental change of their child. So a kindergarten child will want, and the parent will likely want to be heavily involved. And there's certainly research to show that parents who are involved in the kids' education, the kids have better outcomes. I mean, that's
Yeah.
pretty clear. Now, involvement for some parents means different things. Um, some obviously mean like going to parent-teacher night, going to school, going to school events, that kind of thing, like the sort of on-site, in-person type of thing. Some of the parent involvement might be more at home, like making sure there's space at home for kids to do their homework, helping them with their homework, taking them to the library, giving books to read, that kind of home support.
Mhm.
And that depends, of course, on the expertise of the parent and the time. If you got two parents working like multiple jobs, they barely have time to, make sure everybody's getting fed, kind of thing. It's going to be harder. But the idea is to be supportive of what the education's about.
Mhm.
Now you get up to high school, the parent may not be involved as much day to day, like on everything, but still the parent needs to be still showing the interest and showing the support of this need as education becomes more serious. Therefore making sure the student is spending time on their studies, going to obviously attending, going to class, doing assignments, and of course, if there's any behavior happening, dealing with that. But also helping the student think towards, okay, where your studies leading you with regard to post secondary work, whatever. The family dynamics will play a role there too, because as kids get older, they probably want their parents. They may not want their parents on site all the time. Like in elementary school, the parents might go supervise like a sports day or a hockey game, but they may not want their parent there when they're at a dance, because they don't want their parents seeing with who they're dancing with. That kind of dynamic is there too.
Yeah.
But so the families have to figure it out themselves what's going to work. But we do know that parental involvement, positive parental involvement does lead to, generally speaking, better outcomes in their learning, because, learning takes place all the time. The attitude towards learning is going to start in the home, and then it comes to school. The space of doing so, the resources needed, that kind of thing. So there's going to be variation, but I would say parents could choose what they want to be involved in and the extent they want to be involved, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and it's kind of the running joke, and because my first few, obviously, like I said, few years now, my wife teaches kindergarten and I taught grade 12 for my first few years, and so night and day, I guess, in terms of what the parents talk to you about.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I had 150 students one semester, and like send in your weekly, bi-weekly emails. I might get one reply every now and then. Like in grade 12, they're not too worried about it. And then my wife can send an email out and 15 parents respond with different questions. And it's just a whole different dynamic. But the other part of that running joke was the parents we saw on parent teacher night were never the ones that we needed to see, because it was the ones who are actually involved and actually signing up.
Right.
It's their kids that actually have that. Like, I think that's one thing I think about a lot, is the attitude toward learning in students. It's not necessarily like, are you going to get a 99% in grade 7 math? Because you might be like peaking early almost, and you kind of, school comes easy to you. But if you don't have that like attitude towards improving, that can be arguably, I think, one of the biggest skills, or I guess attitudes to develop. And so one more kind of area that I want to discuss with you today is that we've talked about leadership, and I'm sure a lot of the questions in this specific area we've kind of already touched on, but you talk about leadership and also professional learning communities. So I guess first off, we talk about professional development. What is the difference between PD and a professional learning community? And like, what is kind of your, I guess, research interest in that?
Okay, well, so professional development is more like an event. Like you go to a PD event. And normally, often the way PD is delivered, it's decided by somebody above. Like principal side, we're going to do a PD on this, or the district side decide everybody in this district is going to get a PD on topic. So it's more an event, like a PD activity or PD day or whatever. Professional learning communities, the word community suggests more a group of people who are in this community who are engaged in professional learning. So therefore, it's less episodic and more continuous. Now, my retired colleague at St. Thomas University, he and I spent a bunch of years doing research on PLCs. We actually created a couple instruments, like a survey instrument that a school used to see what is the PLC culture of the school. Because PLCs involve things like the culture. Is there a learning culture? Like, is there a culture of learning by teachers? Are teachers actively trying to learn themselves? And are they doing that in community? Like, are they learning from each other as well as other sources? So it's much more organic, in the sense that these are teachers who are learning together in a community, and the learning is oriented towards their professional duties, which is student learning. So they're learning what they need to learn so they can deliver their teaching to their students. So that's the difference between PD, which is episodic, and learning community, which is it's more of a grouping of people engaged in a longer term efforts to improve the learning by themselves and therefore learning of students.
And because I did notice that I got hired with the Anglophone South District this year as a resource teacher. And within like the umbrella of resource teacher, there's like the resource teachers themselves. And I guess there's like a new position. I'm not sure if they have it out in the Fredericton like wing with the West District, right? It's an academic support teacher, like an AST. And so I guess, but the thing I really liked about it was next Friday, and like kind of our first week back, there's a specific PLF day with all the ASTs from every school that are going to meet together. So that's probably that idea of like it was a PD day that didn't have an agenda yet. I'm sure it will, but it
Right.
has the group, which I
Yes.
like because now apparently I've been told this is like a new position the district's trying out, I guess, within these PLCs. But I love that I have these 12 people that I can always kind of like shoot an email and be like, hey, what do you guys think about this?
Yeah.
And that way it's like, oh, I'm not actually just kind of winging this job in this one school that I don't really know. It doesn't have a clear definition. You can kind
Right.
of create the definition together. Is that kind of
Right.
what the PLC is kind of geared toward?
That's right. The idea is that teaching is not meant to be an isolated act. You decide all by yourself. So you learn from each other, just like in other types of jobs where people often work in teams. Like if you're a law firm, often you have a group of lawyers working on multiple cases. If you're in a business, if you're in like an advertising company, you have a group of advertising, people who will plan together a campaign. So it's the same thing with educators. So because no one person can have all the ideas and all the best strategies for all the students you got to deal with, right? So creating this community. Now sometimes it's orchestrated by the district where they'll say, right, you folks will be a community, therefore you shall do this. And if you give enough latitude for them to decide organically what they're going to learn based on their own priorities, that's a good. I mean, that would be closer to the ideal of PLC, which is organic, self-driven learning based on what their their job needs are. That would be good.
Yeah, I loved it. Like when I first saw it, I was like, oh, that's awesome that we kind of get our own day away from our school at the district to actually like figure out and kind of ask the stupid questions, because you don't really want to ask the stupid questions in a general audience because they're like, who is this guy? Like, what is he now? Like, I don't know. But you know what I mean? That's kind of gives you that context to do that.
Yeah. And the same at the school level. I mean, the school level, now sometimes the school will have organized like grade level teams or subject departments, or this principal might set up, he or she might say, we are going to be you folks will be at PLC for whatever, like assessment, like assessment or activities or whatever. Sure, that's fine. It becomes a little more contrived when the leadership, dictates both the grouping and what they do. Because if you're going to do that, that's really more of a meeting than it is a PLC. But still, if there's that space designed for having people have these learning focused conversations, and that was the other thing we emphasized in our research was you're not just getting together to complain and grumble. You're there to learn, right? So it's got to be purposeful.
Ken, no one does that. Okay, it does not happen. I don't know what you're talking about. I guess I got one more question for you. It's kind of the way I end off most of my podcast episodes. Is that I tell you a cheesy quote, and I ask you to answer the question following. So it's education is what remains once we forget everything that we learned in school. So I guess the question is, what is it that you want even your doctoral students, your master's students, or even just your general students to take away from their time with you specifically that they won't get with anyone else?
Well, I think in recent years, I've been really emphasizing educators need to have a sense of moral purpose that may be informed by what other people tell them, whether it's the law or the government or whatever. A sense of moral purpose, like what's most important to you, and focus on that, and put bounds around what you're doing, so you can focus on what's most important. I think that would be my one. If I could pick one lesson, that might be it.
Beautiful. All right, well, Dr. Brien, thank you so much for coming on today, sir. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure too.